Hey everyone, my name is Ishan, and I'm here to give a talk today on building a developer homepage, which I nicknamed One Stop Shop for Developers. So, as mentioned, my name is Ishan. Really excited to be speaking with you guys virtually today. I've been an engineer here at Cortex for about 8 months, and I was one of the main engineers who kind of worked on this developer homepage feature. And prior to this, I was working at Roblox, where I witnessed firsthand a lot of the reasons why I feel like the developer homepage is a powerful boost to developer productivity. So the first thing is just a high-level overview of what a developer homepage is. So a developer homepage aims to tackle some of the issues that kind of come up with a typical developer's workflow, where they spend a lot of time context switching and going between different tools and different things that are integrated into their stack rather than just spending all their time kind of focused on coding and developing and pushing whatever product it is forward. So, a developer homepage aims to combat a lot of this by providing help with unifying tooling, providing a personalized view of different tools. So, rather than maybe a global view or organization wide view, it provides you with insights that are specific to you and relevant to you. Um, and then we'll also go through during this talk. Most of the talk will be focused on the actual implementation and different decisions we made, obstacles we ran into, and then we'll wrap it up with a look to action items, which are I think a pretty powerful feature of the developer homepage that allow you to get tangible things to actually work on as a developer. So first off, unification. So this little diagram kind of shows a developer in the middle, surrounded by some different tools, and it's meant to signify that although this slide kind of only shows you three of the tools that might be in your tooling stack, there's still a certain amount of time that a developer spends switching from these different tools. So they might have their source control obviously in GitHub. They might be reviewing PRs there. They might log into Jira in order to see what tasks they have, what's pending, what's going on with the rest of their team sprint. They will use PagerDuty to see when they have upcoming on calls, if they want to schedule time off, or if there's an incident or anything's going on, they want to know who to contact for that. So even in this simple example of just three tools, you can already see that there's going to be a certain cost to just even though each of these tools individually is bringing benefit, there's going to be a certain cost in using them distinctly, whether that's having a bunch of tabs open on your computer or you having to actually physically switch between different tools for different pieces of information. There's just ultimately kind of a cost to the developer. So next up, we'll dive into the implementation and talk about some of the nitty gritty aspects of developer homepage and how we solve the unification problem. So first off, what we need to do is build a concept of identity. So identity is fundamentally just who you are and how you kind of fit into your teams. So for the who you are piece, you can kind of be someone different on different tools that you might have. So there's certain things that we roughly expect to be the same. For example, your name and your email. So this is kind of like the first line of defense or first filtering criteria that we use in order to kind of map you across different tools. But a lot of times these simple identifying pieces of information can fail, whether that's because you maybe spell your name differently in different tools, or you include a middle name, or you have a nickname, or use different emails, or even it could be just that the API itself doesn't return a complete response or doesn't have email included in its response, which seems like it shouldn't be possible, but you'd be surprised what you find with third party APIs that you try to use. So then that's when we rely on something a little bit more heavy duty like OAuth, where a user actually comes in and authenticates with the developer homepage and basically clicks a button that gives you the classic pop-up of like allow this tool to kind of use make whatever request or make whatever calls it needs to. So that gives us a much more often can give us a much more complete picture of who you are. And then the second piece is how you fit into your team. At Cortex, we kind of built this concept of external group memberships, but just broadly speaking, it has to do with who what it has to do with the ingestion process of taking teams on a third party platform and kind of slotting you within those. So we might just grab all the teams that exist, like all the GitHub teams that exist for a given organization, and then figure out which ones you belong to. So once you have this concept of identity, you then move on to ownership. Identity kind of helps inform the data we want to fetch and the data that you personally own. So to take a simple example or to take one example of GitHub, you would want instead of making a query for all pull requests that are available on GitHub, we specifically want to get things that involve you. So things that you might have authored, things that you might have assigned, that might be assigned to you, that might be requested on for review. Just basically things that you specifically are involved with. And we also might want to make a query for pull requests that are involving teams that you're part of. So making sure that not only are we picking up things that you're individually tagged on, but also things that your team is responsible for, or that maybe your team is tagged as a code owner on. So yeah, so now that we have these two concepts of identity and ownership, we can look at an example of actually how we went about fetching some of this data. So this is a GraphQL query that we wrote. It's simplified a lot and condensed down, but kind of the big pieces are still there. This one is kind of grabbing the open PRs that aren't archived and that involve my GitHub username. And yeah, this is kind of how the identity and ownership pieces kind of come into play, and you can make queries for actual specific users. Some things I wanted to call out were we ended up kind of combining a lot of these queries together to avoid rate limits. So instead of fetching things on a per user basis, we still want to get information that's relevant to your specific user, but we might issue a massive query or a few massive queries to kind of reduce the rate limit and reduce the cost that we're actually using for GitHub servers and the amount of actual trips we have to make. We also noticed that the GraphQL GitHub API and the REST API are completely separate rate limit resources. So we kind of took advantage of this fact and made certain calls in our application on each of those two. A lot of this process was also honestly just finding the right keywords to do the search. We went through a lot of iterations where we noticed things like that just wouldn't work or that wouldn't be best for our use case, and we kind of just had to figure out how to actually use the API in the way we wanted to get kind of this specific picture or big view of the information that we kind of needed. And then one thing we also ran into specifically with GitHub was that the API limits you to 1,000 results. So if we're making a massive query for a bunch of users, we might get more than 1,000 results. So we kind of had to figure out a way to paginate the data and on our own. So what we ended up doing was we changed the query to actually include information on date. So that way we were making a new query each time for specific time intervals, and we didn't run into the 1,000 results limit since we were changing the query that we were actually making. So yeah, long story short, a lot of small technical nuances that we kind of ran into with each API we kind of dealt with, but some big picture items were kind of this concept of coming up against rate limits for big customers who might have a lot of developers, and making sure we're kind of finding the nooks and crannies of the different APIs, and also dealing with any API specific constraints. Another thing we ran into was for some of our customers that are absolutely massive, they have extremely large data sets. So we got some fun Slack messages like this one where we were contacted by their team, and basically they were saying you're making hundreds of thousands of API calls every day. What's going on here? And so despite a lot of the things we kind of tried to do, we still had this issue of just if you have a lot of data and we want to ingest all that data and present it to the users, we're going to end up having to make a lot of calls. But one way we combated this was with this classic kind of notion in computer science where instead of grabbing the full state of the world at any given point in time, we only were concerned about calculating deltas and calculating differences. So we moved on from doing a full ingestion and full processing of data to only checking for recent updates. This introduced a whole another class of problems because now whenever there's a failure, you have to think about maybe I missed this time window, so I have to refetch for this time window. What if that one fails? Some sort of retry logic, or you basically just have to make your system tolerant since you're not grabbing everything every time you run it. You're only grabbing differences. So in the longer term, we want to move towards something that's a little bit more event driven, like webhooks, to even reduce this API call uh, the amount of API calls we're making even further. But we still need some sort of failure resiliency. So we kind of need a mix of like doing some sort of polling, but then also the event-driven nature of webhooks would allow us to kind of drastically reduce how many outbound requests we're making that aren't giving us new information. So this is an example of in the Jira case how we kind of changed it. We went from this full ingestion where we're grabbing all tickets that don't have an empty assignee and have are to do or in progress to That's the thing we'll run on the very first time someone kind of loads the developer homepage. But then subsequently, we'll only grab things that are updated since a certain date string, um, and then yeah, deal with failures accordingly. And then another thing we thought about was ended up setting custom kind of these sync rates with different providers. So depending on which provider you are and what type of information it is, we might reduce or increase the rate at which we're kind of fetching this data. So for something like on-call rotations, which are subject to change a lot less frequently, you don't expect someone to kind of be going into PagerDuty like every minute and looking for updates. It kind of happens on a bigger time scale. We might fetch that data less frequently than GitHub PRs, which we would want to be a little bit more snappy and responsive to be really useful for developers. So yeah, that's kind of a high level overview of a lot of the implementation details that I wanted to talk about. I also wanted to showcase something known as action items, which I mentioned at the start. Action items allow us to, so now that we have data from all these different tools, we can combine them and kind of generate these powerful insights and make give developers actual things to actually take action on. So these are just some simple examples that I kind of dug up, but some of the things we can kind of surface for you are for a given GitHub repository. Do you have a code owner's file, or did you set up your branch protections correctly to make sure you have two reviews required to merge? We can also integrate with even with other tools like Datadog and see if you have SLOs set up or PagerDuty to make sure that every service has an on-call rotation set up. So since we have these notions of identity and ownership for a given user, and we have information from these different tools, we can actually create business logic that gives people actionable items as part of their developer homepage. And I think this is a really powerful and cool feature that we or a cool aspect of our developer homepage. Also wanted to just showcase the final product. This is kind of what it looks like. There's these cards at the top which provide kind of highlights of different things that we want to showcase for a given user. Then there's these different tabs. This one that I clicked on was the catalog tab, so it shows you all the things, all the services that you might own. There's also tabs for open PRs and assigned PRs, and then Jira issues that we talked about, and action items. So looking towards the future a little bit, what we want to do is we want to combine this concept of polling with event-based data fetching, like I mentioned, to kind of get the best of both worlds, where we're not necessarily making a ton of API requests, but also we are occasionally just making sure that we're getting to some sort of consistency over time. We want to also integrate with more providers. So even within things we've integrated with, like for example, GitHub for source control, we started to expand. So we added GitLab integration, and recently we launched an Azure DevOps integration. We also want to just make sure we're kind of building for the entire ecosystem, since the point of this is to kind of be able to integrate all of it, all third-party tooling eventually into one place, and then also even other providers. So even other tools that might be part of your tech stack that we haven't considered, like your monitoring tools, we'd want that to kind of all be present in one place. And we've also continued to iterate for kind of these ease of use features. So based on feedback that we get from people, we'll incorporate more features into our product. Obviously, for example, on this screenshot, we added these little badges for telling people when PRs are out of date, if they're really quick to review. We even have a badge for like PRs that we deemed are complex, just to give people even more information at a quick glance of like what are quick wins they can have, what is something they need to set aside more time for in order to actually get into. But yeah, just making the developer homepage as easy to use as possible. And as I mentioned, we want to continue our efforts to unify with some other tools and make sure we're making the developer homepage as powerful as we can for other users. So that's pretty much it for the talk. I want to thank everyone. Once again, I'm Ishan. Check out Cortex, obviously, as a developer homepage, if this is something that seems interesting to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. But thanks, everyone. Bye bye.